Welcome, folks. This is one of the first panels for the ASCH 2021. This panel is Face the Pacific, Empire and Religious Histories. And I'm going to introduce to you the three panelists. It's so exciting to be here and to be part of this panel. This is really cutting edge scholarship in a way that I am so happy to see that the ASCH has embraced. So I'll introduce our three panelists and then they'll each talk to you for a few minutes. And as you can see, we have a fairly conversational style going already. So we will continue that with a little time for conversation at the end. So first up, we'll hear from Melissa Borja, who is Assistant Professor of American Culture at the University of Michigan, where she's also a core faculty member in the Asian Pacific Islander American Studies program. She researches migration, religion, politics, pluralism, and race in the United States and the Pacific world, and she pays special attention to the way religious beliefs and practices have developed in the context of the modern American state. Borja's first book, Follow the New Way, Hmong Refugee Resettlement and the Practice of American Religious Pluralism, which is under contract with Harvard University Press, explores the religious dimensions of American refugee care, how governments have expanded capacity through partnerships with religious organizations, and how refugee policies have shaped the religious lives of refugees. And I had the distinct pleasure of being on another panel with Dr. Borja just a couple of weeks ago, and you are in for a treat. It's so exciting to get to hear from you again. And I am equally delighted to introduce my own colleague, Helen Jen Kim, who studies US history and religion with a focus on the Pacific and Asian America. Dr. Kim is co-author of Family Sacrifices, a 2019 Oxford book, and author of a forthcoming book she's finishing up this year on US, or actually has finished, on US evangelicals in the Cold War era, also coming out with Oxford, supported by the Louisville Institute, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Forum for Theological Exploration, and the Korea Institute at Harvard, the Charles Warren Center for American History, and the Center for American Political Studies. Kim is an assistant professor of American Religious History at Candler School of Theology, where we share that mantle. It's a delightful thing. And she's the first Asian American woman and the first faculty of Korean descent at Candler. In 2020, Kim was awarded the Provost Teaching Award for Excellence in Graduate and Professional Education and the Candler's On Eagle's Wings Excellence in Teaching Award. And once again, you are in for a treat. And I get to introduce another of my colleagues in the history department at Emory, Assistant Professor of US History, Chris Sa, whose work in the history department is also very exciting. And his research has been published in the Journal of American History and the Pacific Historical Review. And here at Emory, Sa teaches courses on Asian American history, US, East Asia relations, and comparative studies of race and ethnicity in the United States. Sa is completing his first book, The Allure of Empire, Race and Reform in the Imperial Trans-Pacific, which focuses on interconnections between imperial politics and domestic race relations to understand how historical figures in the early 20th century saw racial subjugation and exclusion as progressive. This is really, I mean, this is such an exciting moment for me, and I am delighted to be introducing these remarkable scholars. You are watching a field in the making, and you are watching here the transformation of the field of American religious history with this scholarship. So without further rambling, I will reintroduce Dr. Borja, and she's gonna start us off.
I'm gonna share my screen, fingers crossed that this works out okay. 1 second. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, it is.
Oh, sorry.
That's great, you are set.
Okay, actually, I think I stopped sharing again, but I will try this again, sorry. Okay, we're good?
We're good.
Okay. In recent years, historians of American religion have paid increased attention to the involvement of Christian organizations in international humanitarian work, adding to and complicating scholarship that has typically focused on Christian foreign missions. However, research still needs to be done on how professionalized Christian humanitarian organizations have negotiated institutions and individuals' longstanding and evolving commitment to missionary work. How have Christian international relief organizations such as World Vision endeavored to share the gospel at the same time they've partnered with government and secular agencies to provide humanitarian aid in religiously plural contexts? And how have Christian organizations handled this tension in different spheres of humanitarian relief? This morning, I investigate these two questions by focusing specifically on the case of medical missionaries who worked in refugee camps in Thailand in the 1970s and 1980s. I draw on several bodies of primary sources, including the archival records of the American Refugee Committee, a medical relief agency, and memoirs and personal papers of medical missionaries who worked there. As I considered these records, I was curious to see how Christian physicians and nurses aim to fulfill two responsibilities. First, the call to save souls as missionaries who were faithful to Christianity. And second, the call to save bodies as medical doctors who were faithful to secular medical science. Today, I'm going to argue that missionary physicians and nurses often prioritized medical care first and struggled with the expectation imposed on them by the Christian relief agencies to share the gospel with their refugee patients. The choices made by Christian medical missionaries reveal how the meaning and practice of missionary work changed throughout the course of the 20th century. In addition, it shows how Christians involved in humanitarian work were forced to adapt to new circumstances of religious pluralism and international systems of public-private humanitarian aid. Before I jump into discussing these issues, let me first offer some context about the Southeast Asian refugee crisis in the 1970s and 1980s. During this period, war, genocide, and famine in the region forced the displacement of thousands of people in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Some refugees fled by air, others by boat, and many crossed overland into Thailand, where they found shelter in several refugee camps, including Ban Vinai, pictured here. By the time refugees made it to Thailand, they were often in dire shape, having endured long journeys and numerous traumas. The refugee camps themselves were often poorly equipped to handle the thousands of refugees who arrived every month. Given the humanitarian crisis in Thailand, government and private aid agencies worked together to aid refugees in the region. This collaborative arrangement reflected some general patterns in international humanitarian care throughout the 20th century. First, international aid was an effort that combined the resources of both public and private institutions. And second, religious institutions were particularly involved in humanitarian work. Finally, the interest in humanitarian work coincided with a new vision of Christian missionary work that focused on social concerns alongside saving souls. Christian organizations from all around the world, across the theological and denominational spectrum, powered much of the work in refugee camps. A look at the work in Ban Vinai camp, for example, reveals how Christian agencies were involved in almost every aspect of aiding refugees. The Christian and Missionary Alliance, for example, ran a handicraft sales project, a small pig raising project, and a rice mill. Catholic Relief Services operated an in-hospital patient feeding program and a sewing and tailoring school. Finally, World Vision, an evangelical organization, provided relief and emergency supplies, educational and vocational training, English language instruction, home garden projects, and family development programs. Most importantly, World Vision provided all of the inpatient and outpatient medical services for the tens of thousands of refugees at Ban Vinai. The prominence of Christian aid organizations in the refugee camp raised a critical question. Sorry. It was this: how to handle proselytizing. Indeed, some relief organizations criticized how Christian agencies and church groups intertwined aid and evangelism. Doing so, they pointed out contradicted official policy. For example, voluntary agencies officials discussed recent reports of proselytizing in the camps at a consortium of relief organizations. The consortium leader at the time, Mr. Van Leeuwen, responded by reading the guidelines for religious activities set forth by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or the UNHCR. This is what it said: organizations active in the delivery of emergency relief work may also have a religious aspect in their normal work. Some are traditional partners of UNHCR with a separation between these two roles long established and well understood. But for others, it may be useful to recall the basic principle. Religious activities by those outside the refugee community, where permitted by the authorities, must be clearly disassociated from the delivery of assistance and services to refugees. In particular, no proselytizing should take place in association with the provision of such general community services as education, health and social welfare, or in connection with the employment of refugee workers. Mr. Van Leeuwen urged humanitarian agencies to modify its activities, but still, non-religious organizations sometimes complained about the persistent proselytizing in these camps, especially by World Vision. In one report, a physician at one refugee camp said he was, quote, very down on the evangelical agencies, with evangelical in scare quotes, saying that they didn't provide enough medical care, that those agencies which provide medical care without proselytizing do a better job. Religion also complicated how Christian and non-Christian agencies related to one another. World Vision worked closely with non-religious organizations such as the American Refugee Committee. However, the officials at World Vision International headquarters in California at one point demanded that their Christian organization no longer employ or work with non-Christian groups. Religion even complicated how the agencies participated in meetings with one another. When a religious voluntary agency representative wanted to begin consortium meetings with prayer, officials from the other voluntary agencies protested. The secular agencies insisted that they must operate with religious neutrality, that was their term, and suggested that the group begin each meeting with a moment of silence rather than prayer. These conflicts reveal an important fact, which is that Christian relief agencies were not just relief organizations responsible for refugees' health and safety. They were also deeply religious organizations that were often committed to refugee salvation. And to be sure, Christian voluntary agencies understood what it meant to share the gospel in different ways, depending on their theology and denominational affiliation. However, evangelical agencies, churches, and volunteers had a significant presence in the camps, and they were very enthusiastic often about combining relief work with missions. For individual staff members of these Christian agencies, evangelism was often a central objective of their work. Lois Fischer, for example, was a Presbyterian physician who saw herself first and foremost as a missionary. She had a long career as a medical missionary in Africa and also in India, and she arrived in Southeast Asia to work with refugees from Cambodia and Laos in Thailand. A devout woman who began each day with Bible study, Dr. Fischer saw her work as a physician as a unique form of Christian witness and deliberately chose to affiliate with Christian hospitals and voluntary agencies. She saw the refugee camps as the product of human sin, a site of suffering having its, quote, origins in the diabolical inhumanity of man to man. But she also viewed the refugee camp as a site of God's love, expressed in the work of Christian volunteers like herself. The refugee camp, she wrote, reflects God's grace shown in loving service by volunteers. In many ways, the refugee camps provided ample opportunity for Dr. Fischer to do missionary work. She was in regular contact with non-Christian refugees, especially Hmong refugees who practiced traditional Hmong shamanism. She was clearly fascinated by the rituals of Hmong people, and she took great care to document all of them in a photo album and in her personal papers. A close look at these records reveals that Fischer was very skeptical of Hmong shamanism. She regarded Hmong rituals as a hindrance to the practice of scientific Western medicine and a sign of Hmong people's lack of modernity. As she said, non-Christian Hmong of all ages retain their faith in shamans or spirit healers. The Hmong may even interrupt our scientific modern medicine treatment to have ceremonies in scare quotes, to appease whatever spirit of ancestor usually is displeased and has brought on the patient's illness. And she often expressed her frustration that Hmong beliefs about the spiritual origins of illness had discouraged the sick from seeking Western medical care. As she wrote, the Hmong do not like much to come to the hospital when they are sick. At first, they should ask the shaman, and he asks the spirits. Sometimes is our help too late? They dress the dead body in the original Hmong dress, if they have, and they do a lot of ceremonies. However, when treating her non-Christian Hmong refugees, patients, Fischer and other Western medical practitioners made efforts to accommodate their traditional practices, even if they were skeptical of them. Voluntary agencies established a traditional medical center at Ban Binai, for example, and individual physicians like Fischer herself acknowledged the significance of these practices to Hmong patients and appeared to tolerate them. Fischer described the ways in which medical staff supported traditional Hmong healing. As she said, Hmong people have faith in herbalists, and in fact, ZOA, which is an aid organization, has one foreign staff member assisting the herbalists in getting herbs, and 2 public health centers have added a Hmong herbalist to their treatment staff. So patients have a choice between medics and herbalists. In addition to accommodating non-Christian healing practices, Christian medical missionaries sometimes found it uncomfortable and inappropriate to talk about the gospel when opportunities did arise to do so. And here it's instructive to look at the reflections of Rudolf Skogerby, another Christian physician who worked at Ban Binai and worked with World Vision's medical staff in 1982. Now, in its staff guidelines, World Vision emphasized that Christian evangelism should be a priority, but Skogerby admitted that sharing the good news sometimes seemed ill-advised in the face of such urgent need and deep suffering. One beautiful Hmong woman was suffering because of attempted suicide, he said. She was depressed and felt hopeless because her family had been killed in Laos. At that moment, though, he realized that the care she needed was not necessarily a religious message. As he wrote, I felt it would be a little out of place to preach about the love of God. What she needed was someone to care for her, even if it was just a little. So I find that distinction pretty interesting in those last lines, a distinction between caring for her and preaching about the love of God. Skoger was concerned that sharing the gospel might be a little out of place reveals an important shift. Compared to the more forceful style of spreading the gospel pursued by other missionaries in the region, missionary physicians like Dr. Fischer and Dr. Skogerbo tended to tread more carefully when working with non-Christian patients. And a few factors may have contributed to this change in approach. For one, they were responsible for pursuing Christian witness primarily through the delivery of medical care to the indigent, whereas other missionaries had different responsibilities and obligations. Also, Christian ideas about missionary work were quite different by the end of the 20th century. And by the 1970s, the practice of openly seeking Christian converts was, in the eyes of many people working in the camps, a violation of UNHCR rules, an inappropriate practice for medical professionals serving refugees, and an outdated, culturally imperialistic mode of missionary work. Even organizations that made the most passionate calls for combining missionary work with relief work acknowledged the potential abuses of power that can take place with this approach. So in conclusion, I argue that missionaries aim to share the gospel, but being a medical missionary appears to have complicated that call. And why does this matter? Well, I suggest that it emphasizes that there can be a disjuncture between policies of organizations and on the ground in the clinic practices of people. And the fact that individuals might feel uncomfortable doing simply what their institutions might ask them to do. But it also emphasized the importance of considering context when understanding what missionary encounters and pluralist accommodations involved. A hospital is a site of new life, of death, of suffering. And it's a very different place for an encounter to unfold than a school classroom or a community center. So perhaps as much as theology or denomination, the setting of missionary work, I suggest, might matter more in shaping how it is practiced. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
We're the only applause that that you can see, so we'll applaud one another. That was delightful. Thank you so much, Dr. Borja. And now we'll hear from Helen Jen Kim.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Anthea and Caleb, for organizing us in this digital format, and Allison for moderating us, and Melissa and Chris for rallying this Friday morning. And amid this pandemic, I'm just so glad that we could have this virtual conference. So this morning, I am going to talk about the book on U.S. Cold War evangelicals that I am completing. And one of the organizations that I do work on is World Vision. So it's great to hear Melissa talk about World Vision. I work on them in the mostly the 50s, 60s, and a little bit in the 70s. So it's interesting to hear how they develop into the later decades. But this morning, I'm going to talk about Billy Jong-hwan Kim and Billy Graham. My paper is titled War, Race, and U.S. Evangelicalism. On June 3rd, 1973, Billy Jong-hwan Kim, a South Korean minister with Baptist and Carolina roots like Billy Graham, joined the white Southern evangelist at a wooden pulpit custom made for two. Billy Kim, just a few inches above 5 feet, mounted a wooden booster to match Billy Graham's towering height of over 6 feet. On this day, they preached to 1.1 million people, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association's largest crusade. And one might reasonably assume that Graham, the revivalist, advisor to U.S. presidents, and leader of modern evangelical America, preached this, his largest crusade, at a Southern football stadium or Sunbelt megachurch. Yet it was in South Korea, of all places, that the BGEA, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, with the help of Billy Jong-hwan Kim's translations in Korean, arrived at its revivalistic apex. So why South Korea? And what does it reveal about modern evangelical America? To answer these questions, I argue that we need to understand the Pacific-facing career of America's Cold War and the hidden transpacific networks that animated the rise of modern evangelical America. For indeed, the Korean War, the first hot war of the Cold War, is the primary historical force that explains why the BGEA achieved its revivalistic pinnacle in Seoul on June 3rd, 1973. While Billy Graham primarily preached a transatlantic route, he made his first travels across the Pacific to Korea in December 1952 amid the war. And some of you all have heard me, just the first snippet that I read, you've heard me speak about this before. And today, the emphasis that I want to put on is especially what happened in 1952 and how that had its full fruition in the 70s. And what happened in December 1952 is called Christmas in Korea. This is Graham's Christmas in Korea. And several historians have discussed this particular moment in Graham's career in their recent works, especially taking a close look at a document called I Saw Your Sons at War, the Korean Diary of Billy Graham. And also because Graham's Christmas in Korea was spent with World Vision's Bob Pierce and Reverend Kyung-Jik Han, the World Vision documents also reflect some of this moment in December 1952, Christmas in Korea. But the historians who have worked on these sources have yet to argue, as I will today and in my book, that it helped to set the stage for the BGEA's milestone crusade in 1973, which I argue rendered Seoul a central city for our understanding of the rise of modern evangelical America. Unlike the relatively bloodless battle between the US and Soviet Union, the Cold War in Asia, including the Korean War and the Vietnam War, cost millions of lives and devastated nations, the legacies of which continue today, with North and South Korea divided and still technically at war. Like the US and the Philippines, war rendered the US and South Korea permanently inseparable nations. And when we remember the Korean War, often called the Forgotten War, and take seriously Lori Mathley Kipp's heed to historians of American religions to turn toward the Pacific, I suggest that we can no longer say that modern evangelical America rose from Bible Belt to Sun Belt, but must extend that geographical imagination across the Pacific and into Asia. To be sure, my work is thoroughly indebted to Darren Dochek's argument. I'm simply interested in extending it. And when we do so, we see that the US Cold War in Asia not only expanded the non-white global family of modern evangelical America, but also shaped its racial character. And we see a relatively hidden process in which whiteness laid a foundation for the growth of networks like the BGEA vis-a-vis Korea, which in part would help to later yield Evangelical America's milestone crusade that I talked about in the very beginning in 1973. But Graham's preaching on the Korean War battlefront in 1952 helped to sacralize whiteness, linking white Jesus, white soldier, and white evangelist, which was core to what I call racialized anti-communism. That is I point to the non-state anti-communist networks forged through US Cold War empire building in Korea, which helped to sustain white supremacy in the Cold War civil rights era. If the Cold War was a religious Cold War, as historian Andrew Preston has put it, then the story we briefly reviewed today shows how transpacific formations of race were crucial for waging the religious Cold War in Korea, as America carried out its divine mandate to save the world from, quote, the spiritual evil of atheistic communism. And before I dive into the specific moments I want to highlight from Christmas in Korea, I do want to note that in my project, South Korean Protestants like Billy Jong-un Kim, like the Korean founder of World Vision, Reverend Kyung Ji Khan, and others that I study, they share with white fundamentalists and neo-evangelicals at this time a vision that the Cold War, the Korean War specifically, is a holy war. They're specifically very much they very much see the war as against what they saw in atheistic and evil North Korea. So South Koreans actually share with them a kind of religious vision about the war. But I want to highlight that they didn't simply mimic their white counterparts. South Korean Protestants had their own responses to US Cold War empire building. And so that indigenous response is very much crucial to my book, and it's highlighted throughout. But I'm also concerned with what historian of world Christianity, Hugh Hansel, says, quote, while non-Western Christians now represent the face and future of global Christianity, and that's such an emphasis and growing area of our field. He says also, though, that due to prevailing attitudes of Western superiority, and I would add also white supremacy, quote, the church in the non-Western world does not yet constitute its main driving force. And I think we have to continue to probe into why that continues to be the case. Because even as local agency is powerful and it's a crucial part to my own project, the structures of power with which global Protestants have contended and continue to contend with also need to be highlighted. And so that's what I'm going to focus on in the last section of this paper, with a dive into Christmas in Korea. So Graham spent Christmas in Korea with the Pentagon's approval 1 month after Eisenhower's election in 1952. Quote, the burden of Korea was particularly heavy, he noted, as missionaries, chaplains, Christian GIs, and Korean Christian leaders urged him to visit war-torn Korea. On Christmas Eve, Graham traveled to the battlefront to preach to US servicemen, an evening he said he would never forget. While most military pulpits were barren, Marines adorned the pulpit with artwork that day. a U.S. Marine prepared a 6-foot painting of Jesus, depicted as a meek white man with flowing hair, wearing a white robe draped around his shoulders. Under a dark and ominous sky, the meek white Jesus watched over a tired and discouraged white Marine who, while holding his rifle, crouched down on the ground in front of a Korean-style house called a kiwajip. Yet in the background, behind this large painting of the white Jesus and white Marine, hung Southern flags from North Carolina, Arkansas, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, foregrounding the U.S. South in this moment of Southern Baptists preaching on Korean soil. The white South and South Korea, white Jesus and white Marine merged in this preaching hour as it conjured up nostalgia for home, stoked white Southern regional pride, and knit together the triad of Jesus, soldier, and evangelist. As Graham stood confidently at this pulpit, he breathed life into these otherwise lifeless material objects and deflated figures. And Graham served as the transpacific linchpin that fused the white Jesus, soldier, and evangelist together in this moment on the Korean War battlefront. Sociologist Nadia Kim argues that Koreans most thoroughly learned American racial hierarchy of white supremacy through mass media and military culture, especially in the aftermath of World War II with the arrival of the US military in Korea. Though my colleague Chris's work shows how in the progressive era, those ideas also migrated right across the Pacific. Nadia Kim, though she doesn't specifically highlight the role of religion or religious material culture, we see here the crucial role that anti-communist American evangelists like Graham played in activating and circulating US ideas of race through the sacralization of whiteness, as the images of white Jesus, white soldier, and white evangelist were strung together on the Korean War battlefront. So I want to just highlight kind of the religious symbolism that maybe doesn't appear in Nadia Kim's work. While historians have shown that global forces propelled racial reform in the Cold War civil rights era, anti-communism through McCarthyism and beyond also stagnated racial progress. To be sure, international pressures to safeguard the nation's image overseas as a global leader against communism in part prompted racial desegregation, as Mary Dudziak's work powerfully shows. President Truman's Executive Order 9981 created the first racially integrated military during the Korean War, a significant moment in civil rights reform. But as Carol Anderson's work shows, Black activists at this time also narrowed their vision from a global human rights frame to a civil rights frame in the face of America's Red Scare, as they were dubbed communists. They fundamentally truncated their claims to equality in the face of this pressure, as they were pressured to conform to a Cold War consensus, compelling them to choose between domestic civil rights on the one hand or international peacemaking on the other, including the anti-war cause in Asia. So truncating their vision to something more locally and also kind of backing away from the anti-war cause was core to what I call racialized anti-communism. So building upon Anderson's research, I suggest that Graham's preaching in this moment of Christmas in Korea reveals the non-state trans-Pacific networks, especially the anti-communist religious ones that reinforced rather than reformed US racial hierarchy in the Cold War civil rights era. And this happens across the Pacific in a country like South Korea. And indeed, the conservation of domestic racial lines on foreign soil did not detract from Graham's revivalistic message, but only further boosted it. Though the white Marine in the painting was defeated, he would soon rise with the help of the meek white Christ, and so would Graham, the white evangelist, adorned in military garb that day and ready for battle as a soldier for Christ. The preaching hour on the Korean War battlefront was not just a performance, but it became animated in the lives of soldiers. And we see this throughout the documents that I'm studying for this particular paper. Graham declared, quote, "Never in my ministry have I preached with more liberty or power. The Spirit of God seemed to fall on the meeting." Many of the, quote, big, strong, tough Marines were weeping unashamedly because of their sins and their need of a savior. One of the big Marines who had calloused hands from years of fighting gripped Graham's hand and thanked him with tears streaming down his face. Graham associated this marine spiritual awakening and emotional release with increased masculinity. Quote, I was proud of him and proud of every one of those men, the finest of American youth. Everyone was a rugged he-man. Everyone was a courageous, red-blooded American. And among the many scholars who have studied this moment, and Kristen Dumais notes in her most recent work, Jesus and John Wayne, that this is a moment that reflects the militarized masculinity that pulsed at the heart of modern evangelical America. And I want to add the racialized dimensions of this muscular militarism, which sacralized the white soldier alongside the image of the white Christ, and emboldened Graham as a white evangelist also on US borders. Because Graham's presence not only elicited the performance of sacralized whiteness on Korean soil, just that preaching moment and that painting, but it also very much comes alive as kind of animating this image of the white Jesus soldier and evangelist against the actual literal war against communism, which he understood as a holy war. And this work gets reinforced full circle to the US, shaping evangelical America also locally, helping to render this work that's informed by racialized anti-communism through individual conversions, and helping to imagine this work also as holy work. So when Graham returned from Christmas in Korea, his understanding of revival as a solution to combating communism and solving international affairs only strengthened. In 1953, on the Independence Day following his Korean trip, Graham preached in Texas, quote, communists are doing their deadly work in government and education. There's only one way that the stars and stripes can continue to wave above the land of the free and the home of the brave, and that is for a great spiritual revival to break out in America. If we would have true repentance and an individual turning to Christ, our international problems would solve themselves. And when this sermon was distributed as a phonograph record, a photo of Graham sitting with South Korean President Syngman Rhee, taken during Christmas in Korea, was put on the cover. So it further legitimated Graham's ideas. Graham imagined that saving souls one by one could solve foreign affairs. His experiences in South Korea, forged through preaching to U.S. Marines at the Korean War battlefront, underscored this vision during his preaching in the American South. And 20 years later, exactly 20 years later, in 1973, when Graham returned to Korea to preach his largest crusade on June 3rd, 1973, he hearkened back to the sacralized image of U.S. soldiers, among them one who lost his life for the sake of his 12 friends, in allusion to the 12 disciples of Christ. It's just so fascinating that he opens up the sermon of his largest revival ever to this particular image in the context of the Korean War. The networks that had intertwined between the white evangelists, the US military, and South Korea had come to full fruition on that milestone stage for modern evangelical America. And to understand how that develops over that 20-year period, you're just going to have to read my book. I can't go through all the arguments today, but there's this long development, this transpacific development that is happening, from the Korean War onwards. While the legacies of that era of evangelicalism are many, at least one strand that continues today is the idea that evangelical America continues to wage a variety of holy wars. And I want to add that many of them are underscored by a history of racialized anti-communism, this kind of Pacific-facing aspect, forged through US Cold War empire building in Asia. Thank you.
I turned my mic on so you can hear quiet clapping here to deafen you, but this was delightful. Thank you so much, Dr. Kim. And just a quick note to the audience, a couple of folks have already taken advantage of this. At the bottom of your screen, you see a bubble for Q&A, where if you're familiar with Zoom, you usually see the chat. This is over just beside that. When you have a question, please feel free to go ahead and drop the question in the Q&A. In lieu of summative comments, I'm going to go straight to questions because we've already got at least one really good question to address. So thank you very much, Dr. Kim, and let's welcome Dr. Chris Suh.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully, can everyone see my PowerPoint? Yes? Okay, thank you. All right, just wanted to make sure. Thank you. everyone for coming to our panel Friday morning. I must admit, this is my very first time at ASCH, so I'm also incredibly thankful for this community, but especially my panel, Helen, Melissa, and Allison, for inviting a novice like me to share my work and get some feedback. So I'm incredibly grateful by the opportunity to sort of talk out loud some of the things that I have been working through. Now, the subject of my talk itself, which is about US missionaries who specialized in Japanese immigration and Japanese rights of Japanese immigrants, that subject itself is nothing new. And in fact, some of you might be wondering, like, what exactly do we have to learn? Again, by revisiting some of these very famous figures that I'm going to talk about today, especially Sidney Gullick and Galen Fischer. And but I think that there are certain things that I myself was surprised to find in the archives that I hope will generate some interesting questions as we rethink what U.S. missionary enterprise was like during the Progressive Era and beyond. And just as a sort of this particular audience is probably most familiar with the kind of work in religious history, written by David Hollinger most recently about American missionaries and their encounters with various non-white people abroad, but especially in Asia. But missionaries and Japanese immigrants appear pretty prominently in other fields as well. In immigration history, John Hyam's Strangers in Land does have a pretty substantive discussion of Gullick, as does Roger Daniels' Politics of Prejudice. And I use this slide to kind of just sort of establish, and acknowledge the fact that, like, what I'm going to talk about in some ways is it will be, somewhat sort of redundant in some ways, but the questions that I'm going to ask, I hope will help us kind of revisit this well-trodden ground. And the first half, I want to talk about Sidney Gullick, who is sort of the most well-known, the single most important defender of Japanese immigrants, especially from 1913 to 1924. And those two markers being when California passed the Alien Land Law that was primarily aimed at curbing Japanese ownership of land in California, and to 1924 when US Congress passed Johnson-Reed Act, which sort of finalized Japanese exclusion that had been sort of put in place in the form of gentleman's agreement between the United States and Japan, and this form of restriction of Japanese immigrants. Now, what was so interesting about Gullick, and especially the way that Gullick was perceived by his contemporaries, was that when I was doing this research on what did Koreans in the United States, Korean Americans, the vast majority of whom at this time are Christians and Christian converts, think about Gullick. And I was really shocked to discover that Koreans really, really hated Gullick, especially when the tide of anti-Japanese movement was really high. I sort of took a screenshot of this one because I always kind of chuckle whenever I see sort of early romanization of American names. So he says Senator Phelan is attacking Mr. Gullick, and I'm not sure where the strong G comes from. But what was basically this whole article is actually about is that James D. Phelan, who is this notorious anti-Japanese and actually anti-Asian senator from California, was running for re-election in 1919 and 1920 under the slogan "Keep California White." And yet, when I looked at newspapers published in San Francisco by Korean Christians, they were cheering Phelan on as he was attacking Gullick not only in public but also in congressional hearings. So I wondered, what is going on in here? What is it about Gullick, who seemed very benign in my view, and then seemed like there was nothing controversial about his defense of Japanese immigrants? That was sort of the question that sort of began this journey. And this then kind of sort of took me to look at Gullick's writings and Gullick's letters more closely, including the Gullick family papers there at Harvard. And what was very interesting is that in sort of the historiography of US-Korea relations, or even historiography of missionary enterprise in Korea, it is extremely well known that in 1919 is when a lot of Korean anti-colonialists against Japan rose up to sort of call attention to the fact that Japan had been perhaps not been the kind of generous imperial power that it had been sort of projecting itself on the world stage, and more specifically by kind of appealing to Woodrow Wilson and various American missionaries to call attention to the fact that Japanese colonial government was particularly violent in its suppression of anti-colonial uprising. Now, knowing that the missionaries were seen as sort of the great allies of the Korean anti-colonialists, I was actually very surprised by the report that Sidney Gullick and his co-author Haven published on behalf of Federal Council in 1919. And what is interesting is that this very well-known, I will call it a tome, or I guess a book of testimonies called The Korean Situation, is filled with various letters by US missionaries and Canadian missionaries exposing Japanese violence. And yet Gullick and Haven actually basically make it very clear in the preface that they're actually not going to comment on whether Koreans need to be independent or not. They're going to only comment on the violent aspects, and whatever it is going on in terms of the imperial rule, that's not going to be the concern of the FCC. And this actually really does not make a lot of the Korean Americans who can actually read this happy. And as I was reading, especially Korean American newspapers, I was shocked also to discover that Gullick, way back, even going back to 1912, even before he returned to the United States to become the sort of main voice defending Japanese immigrants, actually had defended Japanese incarceration of hundreds of Korean Christians in 1912. And I had to actually find the document again last night. And fortunately, Google Books was there to save me because I couldn't find it in my notes. But basically, Gullick has this interesting message written even while he's in Japan, he's writing to other missionaries saying that, listen, we do recognize that there are a lot of Korean Christians who are protesting that there is religious persecution going on in the Japanese colony of Korea in 1912. But, Gullick says, actually the colonial government in Japan is just trying to prevent this church of, and I'm going to quote here, being perverted from its true function and being made a nursery of disloyalty and sedition. Which actually, is actually pretty, it's how do I put it? It's not so subtle, right? It's a very explicit defense of empire. And so I began to really kind of think about Gullick in much more complicated ways. So, what we know about him in historiography is that he's the defender of Japanese immigrants, but then in the eyes of so many Korean Americans, he is also a defender of Japanese empire, and perhaps what does that mean for all these Koreans who are relying on missionaries to have their voice heard? Now, and what also complicates this is that, and I'm going to sort of introduce the other really well-known figure here, Galen Fischer, who pretty much kind of eclipses Gullick and his influence, especially after 1924. And I want to acknowledge Sarah Griffith's work in chasing down Fischer's photographs, because I could not find any photograph of him, but Fischer was working as a head of YMCA in Japan before he returned to the United States to become actually one of the most important defenders of Japanese immigrants in the 20s and 30s, and then later into the 40s. And Fischer also is actually pretty consistent in his view. And interestingly enough, in order to make the sort of Japanese imperial project legible in the eyes of so many Americans, he actually draws comparisons to what the United States had been done in the Philippines and what the British had done in Ireland. And he basically proposes that, and I'll just go through this quite quickly because there's a lot of text here, is that what is problematic in Japanese colonial project in Korea is not that it is an imperial project to uplift so-called backwards people, but that the problem is that there is sort of imbalance between the so-called the militaristic party of Japan versus the liberal Christian party in Japan. And Galen Fischer basically kind of proposes this sort of a model that the British were really familiar with, which is the liberal empire, an empire that would not have problems itself with sort of subjugation of people, but would limit the way in which that the colonizer approach the colonized would be sort of influenced by what they would consider Christian influences. And he draws all these questions of, all these parallels between US empire in Philippines, Japanese empire in Korea, in order to actually kind of set up to this discussion. And I purposely sort of took a screenshot of this part to sort of kind of set up this prelude of to his discussion, his real interest, which is to perhaps dissuade members of Congress from passing immigration exclusion bill against the Japanese in 1924. So which made me kind of think about, like, why is it that these missionaries take so much interest in what's going on outside the United States, right? Why couldn't they just say Japanese Americans deserve the same civil rights as European immigrants? Why do they feel sort of, I think, sort of encouraged to really also defend Japanese empire? And it's still kind of a puzzle for me, and I wanted to sort of leave it much more sort of open-ended than conclusive, which is that this sort of approach of defending Japanese empire simultaneously while defending Japanese immigrants in the United States basically becomes unsustainable once the Sino-Japanese War, Second Sino-Japanese War that is, begins in 1937. And what is most sort of interesting to me is that we often know, or at least I think in this crowd will be familiar with the fact that one of the most sort of shocking events of the Sino-Japanese War is the Japanese military attack in Nanking, especially what we now know as the rape of Nanking, the brutal massacre of civilians and women and children. And one of the main people who exposed this violence to the world stage is a US missionary to China, Gerald Fitch. And his photographs were really important and crucial in sort of shaping sort of the American views of Japan really in the years leading up to Pearl Harbor. And yet here are just two prominent people, Fischer and Gullick, who are actually defending, but cautiously defending sort of the way the Japanese imperialists were behaving. And it's especially shocking given that, and in this particular these two primary sources, they're referencing the Japanese bombing of USS Panay, which, for those of you who don't know, was the ship that was carrying various US civilians and Chinese civilians who were working in the US embassy in Nanking, and it was sunk literally days before the so-called rape of Nanking happened. And yet Gullick and Fischer and actually some of the lesser known missionaries who were defenders of Japanese immigrants felt that perhaps they needed to also comment on these cases. Now, by the time we get to World War II, however, this defense of Japanese empire completely disappears. And I'm ending this presentation with images of two sort of very well-known issues. And the left is the pamphlet for the Fair Play Committee for Japanese Americans, which was led by Galen Fischer. And this was an organization that wanted to ensure that in the case of war with Japan, Japanese Americans would not be mistreated. And then once Japanese Americans on the West Coast were removed and incarcerated, what we call internment, Galen Fischer actually does emerge as sort of the most sort of vocal and influential figure among missionaries to defend the rights of Japanese immigrants. And by that time, he basically completely sort of disassociates anything that Japan itself was doing across the Pacific. And sort of somewhat like, and on the right side is somebody who is not a missionary, but somebody who has a lot to say about missionaries. And Carey McWilliams, who is often sort of cited as, one of the liberal popular front defenders of civil rights, especially civil rights of various non-white Americans. And McWilliams actually has this very interesting sort of idea where he basically says, he thinks that it's actually not good for the Japanese Americans to have the missionaries as their primary white defenders because of the past association of especially people like Gullick, but also people like Fischer, of their sort of entanglement in this imperial history of Japanese expansion in Asia. So what Carey McWilliams also does is he tries to, starting in 1943, really disassociate the history of Japanese Americans with the history of Japanese Empire. I end this presentation with these two because I think that World War II is basically where we really kind of came to understand the rights of, the history of Japanese Americans, especially, and as well as the history of white allies of Japanese Americans in terms that's separate from their activities defending Japanese empire. And it is a very messy history. And I think that it is only that, when we take account of the fact that, many of these missionaries did not see any contradiction between defending the rights of Japanese immigrants and as well as defending sort of the spread of Japanese empire, that we get a more robust and more precise understanding of what the missionary enterprise was like. And I think just to sort of have a last word about this is that one of the things that's been motivating me to kind of give this presentation this way is that there's been a lot of talk about sort of questioning or trying to make an argument about whether missionaries were racist, anti-racist, imperialist, anti-imperialist. Well, it's very messy, right? And basically it also means that, sometimes, it depends on how you define these terms like racist and imperialist. And in order for us to get a more nuanced understanding of US relations with Pacific, as well as US relations with its Asian Americans, I think that we need to really sort of go back to the primary sources, and as obvious as it might sound, to really tease out the nuances. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Dr. Saw. This has been delightful. I am going to forego any summative comments, as I said, because we have some really wonderful questions here. Each of the questions thus far addresses one particular panelist. So I'm going to choose one question for each panelist to start, and then we'll go from there. So I'm just going to go, the questions are sort of in order of the presentation. So Dr. John Ebel asks, Melissa Borja, I appreciate very much your call to consider the contexts and spaces in which missionary work takes place, and relatedly, the different vectors of mission work broadly understood. I'm curious about other types of conversion that Western agencies, religious and not, may have sought in the refugee camps, such as from one type of domestic structure to another, one set of beliefs about cleanliness, domestic culture to another. Were there modern Western projects or agendas other than medicine in play, and what did those look like?
That's such a great question. Thank you very much. And as I thought about this question, I was reminded of two very different ways people have described refugee resettlement. One refugee policy expert at the time described refugee resettlement as a practice of social engineering, literally said social engineering. A critical refugee studies scholar, Eric Tang, also years later described refugee resettlement as unsettlement. And I think both these interpretations of people who were participating in the event at the time and years later reveal how much conversion there was in multiple dimensions of refugees' lives. This was particularly true for Hmong refugees, who were seen as pre-modern, backward, Stone Age people. There were literally national newspapers that described Hmong refugees as being Stone Age. And so the efforts to convert all aspects of Hmong people's lives were particularly aggressive, both before Hmong refugees came to the United States and it continued once they were in the US. So some of these efforts included, for example, reshaping family structures so that it was more nuclear. Hmong kinship structure is very complex. They traditionally organize themselves into clans. Extended family are critical for the practice of traditional rituals. When Hmong refugees were resettled in the United States, they were spread out. Their ethnic communities were destroyed, but so were their clans, and they were reorganized into more nuclear families. That was through the resettlement bureaucracy. We also see efforts, of course, both before and after resettlement to turn Hmong refugees into self-sufficient, productive economic citizens. A lot of Hmong refugees didn't have any formal schooling before they came to the United States. They came from farming backgrounds or they were soldiers. And so there was already a lot of economic rupture, but there was a deliberate effort to turn them into good economic citizens. And what I think is most interesting probably to this crowd is the effort to remake their religious lives so that Hmong beliefs and practices, which combined animism, ancestor worship, shamanism, when it was filtered through the resettlement bureaucracy, was reorganized as a legitimate religion. So that was a years-long process. It began in the refugee camps and took place through the active efforts among refugees themselves once they were in the United States, when they realized that being able to claim a religion had First Amendment utility. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And just quickly, I'm going to dismiss the questions that I've already asked. And panelists, you're also able to see the questions that we may not get to. We have only about 12 minutes remaining. You have an option to type in an answer to those, so do feel free to do that as you like. I'm going to go to Hillary Kale's question for Helen Kim. You noted, Dr. Kim, the Cold War Korea forged the U.S. evangelicals' view of their own power abroad, especially in Asia. Certainly other historians of the mid-20th century agree, but I wonder what happens if you take a longer view, and I know that you do some of this in your book, so I invite you to talk about that. What about the role of 19th century and early 20th century China in this imaginary? These mainline missions predate neo-evangelicalism per se, but do they still have an impact on how Protestants, including Graham and others, think about East Asia's billions, in quotation marks there, quoting OMF's Missionary magazine?
Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate that question a lot, Dr. Kale. China is very important for my project, though South Korea, North Korea are foregrounded. China is really important because it's with the rise of Mao that Chinese missionaries are kicked out, right? And then a lot of them migrate to Korea. And it's why South Korea becomes so prominent, actually, as a missionary location, post 1949. So China is and a good example you can track just in terms of, with kind of Chris's reminder that we have to really stay close to the sources, and linking to what Melissa was talking with World Vision is Bob Pierce was a missionary in China first, right? And he then, located after, 1945 to Korea. And then World Vision begins and he partners with Reverend Kyung-Jae Khan to create World Vision together, right? So there's this important Korean and Korean War story to World Vision's origins, but it happens to the backdrop of China, right? And it's also this mourning after a quote unquote, kind of this missionary defeat, if you will, in China that also really inspires this desire to really focus in on Korea. Though I think that story itself is also really complicated. If I can address the other two questions that came before that really quickly, because I think I could do it very in a concise way, is to the first question about does Billy Graham's ideas about race change over time? They do. And I will say in the 70s, in chapter 4 of my book, he is much more, thinks about Jesus in a multicultural way. He explicitly says Jesus is not a European, actually Jesus is an Asian. And there's this whole kind of colorblind or colorless image of how who Jesus is, but it's very much defined against any kind of connections to liberation theologies. So Howard Jones, who also partners, a Black evangelist who partners with Billy Graham into the 70s, is also very much defining himself against liberation theologies. Billy Jong-won Kim, who partners with Billy Graham, also very much defines himself against Korean Minjung theologies, also liberationist form. So there's kind of this moderation, a shift, but it's also against any kind of more kind of leftist views of race and religion that are being formed at that time. And I think for the question about the lost cause is something that Allison and I would love to talk to Allison more about. And I think it's really important. And actually, I'll just say that the Asian connection to the lost cause narrative is really important. Even when we think about the siege, the capital siege, for instance, it's important to note, as Viet Thanh Nguyen has noted in his Washington Post editorial, there's a reason why the South Vietnam flag is flying at the capital siege, and it has to do with a similar kind of connection to this lost cause narrative for South Vietnam being paired with the lost cause narrative of the U.S. South. And South Korea is also in there because South Korea fights on the side of South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. So I think there's a lot to say more about that. Yeah. Thanks
so much. I actually want to, Dr. So I'm going to ask you Kimberly Hill's question here, and then I'm hoping we have space. I'd like to take Betsy Kasdan's question about whiteness and ask all three of you a question about that, because I think that there's more to say. But let's start with Kimberly Hill's question for Dr. So. Was the missionary rhetoric in favor of Japanese empire based on the general approval of imperialism in the time period, or was the rhetoric nuanced by specific goals for ministry within Japan?
Now I'm muted. Okay. Just for the sake of time, I'll make it very brief, but that's a wonderful question that actually gets at the heart of the book that I'm working on, which is that these missionaries are interested in the kind of imperialism that seems perhaps free of violence in the way of subjugation. And they actually draw a pretty sharp line between, for example, and a lot of it actually is kind of self-congratulatory, but by the 1910s, United States missionaries in Philippines feel pretty good about themselves because of the way in which that it seems like violence has come, sort of gone down since, let's say, the Philippine-American War. And Japanese imperialists and British imperialists also sort of engage in this sort of international dialogue with one another in terms of thinking about how do we have an empire without sort of the most violent aspects of imperialism. And they basically, all three of them, and I do think that there is kind of like a hunger for imperial exceptionalism among the three imperial powers, that being United States, Britain, and Japan, and especially compared to like Russia, which Russian Empire falls in 1917. Same thing with the Spanish Empire. So some of it is nuanced, but at the same time, a lot of the views of Japanese empire is also very much a reflection of how Americans feel about their own imperial projects, especially in the Philippines and Cuba. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so we have 5 minutes, and so I'm going to ask the panelists to conclude this as, we'll call it a lightning round. So I'm going to read Betsy Kasdan's question, and then I'm going to expand it to ask all of you a question about the relationship of your particular subjects to whiteness. So the question here is, I'm fascinated by Dr. Kim's work showing what looked like the Cold War roots of contemporary links between Christian evangelicals and white supremacy and white nationalist politics. I wonder if you could say more about how Graham and others came to define South Koreans as within the category white, while Chinese and Japanese were not so included. So Dr. Sa, I thought about this question in your context as you were talking about the Korean support for feeling for keeping California white. Well, there's a piece of that works really well if you are also identifying with whiteness. And in another session where I was a panelist, sort of spontaneously describe whiteness as an amoeba. And I keep self-referencing this now, which is kind of weird, but I think in this case it works, right? It's this thing that expands to consume whatever is in its path, with some notable exceptions, right? And also on which people can call. So would each of you just speak very quickly to the relationship of the people you are working on to whiteness in terms of their own identities?
Very quickly, so that I will stop talking. This is the period that I described, right? Is actually a period when not just Koreans, but also Japanese and South Asians actually try to claim U.S. citizenship based on their whiteness. So we have Ozawa and Tin court cases and Supreme Court, right? So of this particular period, yes, there is this sort of attempt to claim whiteness, or at least stretch the boundaries of what whiteness covers. So I do think that is certainly at play in my period.
I just want to jump in though. One key context is they were claiming whiteness because you could not naturalize in the United States unless you were white. So it's not like they wanted to be white. It was because there were constrained legal options available to them, and they were working within that. As I just think that's a really important context when we talk about what defines whiteness and where Asian people and Asian American people fall into that conversation. We can't forget that there were like legal barriers to people becoming citizens because other people define them as not white. I will say things were pretty clear by the end of the 20th century. Hmong people, definitely not seen as white. Vietnamese people, not seen as white. Matt Gaetz, who has been on our screens a lot, if you've been watching Congress, he's one of his hometowns is Niceville, and Niceville had a big resettlement of Southeast Asian refugees. Their high school actually had an effort by students to create a Ku Klux Klan. Okay, so I bring this up simply to emphasize that the perception of Southeast Asian refugees, maybe some of them were perceived as model minorities, a lot weren't, especially Cambodian and Hmong refugees, but they were not seen as white. Full stop.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that clarification. Yeah, I mean, whiteness in this context is really about access to power and citizenship, right? And so that is not equally available to the various people that y'all work on, right? I mean, part of the short story of Chinese whiteness, right, is a story of anti-Japanese sentiment after World War II. Yeah. Dr. Kim.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question, and I have a lot of different things I could say about it as it concerns my project, but I will say that the subjects, especially the South Korean Protestants in my project, there are moments where they strongly ally with the whiteness of fundamentalist America and evangelical America. I highlight those moments very clearly. I mean, Billy Jong-un Kim's time spent almost a decade at Bob Jones, right? And there's a lot to say about that in terms of race and how he tried to identify as closely as possible with that kind of white Christianity, that white fundamentalism. And yet at every moment you see how that project fails. Okay, it doesn't work at every turn. It doesn't work. And so I also show how, Billy Jong-un Kim also is not able to really realize that kind of status. I think it also, it causes some of the groups that I study, the South Koreans, to actually, this is kind of separate from the whole model minority idea but it's linked also, but in terms of wanting to supersede the kind of religious accomplishments of white evangelical America is very prominent. Okay, so like the very large revivals, the expansion of missionaries, I mean, there's definitely a key faith component there, but there's also a desire to compete and exceed, right? And so that's also kind of complicated with how they're being entangled with whiteness. And that's also part of the religious project, I think.
Thank you. What a wonderful session. All of you who have attended, and we have a number of attendees, have really had a treat here this morning. What a wonderful way to start the day. Thank you so much to our three panelists. I believe it's time for us to say goodbye.